For this last set of videos, we're going to be looking at community ecology now, focusing on how organisms interact with each other in the same species and with members of different species. Now, why do we care? Every single organism has a role that it plays within an ecosystem. And when you have missing organisms or roles that are not being filled, the ecosystems can collapse. It's extremely important that everyone plays their part and that these interactions help shape the ecosystem, and sometimes certain organisms or species are more influential than others. So if you remember, a community has all of the organisms in an area that will interact together. And that every species has a niche. Basically, a niche is a specific role that that species plays within an ecosystem. So something like being a predator, or maybe fulfilling a certain role living in a certain environment, being a predator for a certain species, those would be different niches. As a consequence of natural selection, populations commonly become better adapted to their environment, which means other organisms will in turn adapt to them in the process of coevolution. So it's important to note that when we talked about evolution, we kind of talked about it in a vacuum, that organisms are going to interact with their environment, and that was that. But it turns out really we're all interacting and evolving together. So for example, if being fast gets you away from a predator, then the fast prey will survive, but then that also means that the predators have to get faster too. And so they're going to co-evolve with those prey members. Or if they camouflage, if the prey camouflages, then predators may evolve to be able to detect that camouflage better. Another good example is the long-tongued moth and the long-tubed orchid in Madagascar. So this flower, this orchid, has evolved a really long tube, and these moths have these long tongues to go along with it. In this case, this is more of a symbiotic relationship. They're more kind of happy together, where the moth and the orchid want to be in this relationship together, versus the predator-prey example I just gave. So what is a niche? What are the features of a niche? The space that an organism requires, the type and amount of food that an organism utilizes, the timing of their reproduction, their temperature, moisture requirements, and other necessary living conditions, the organisms for which it is a food source, and its influence on competitors. So we're looking at where does it live? What space does it occupy within the given ecosystem? Is it on the ground? Is it in water? Is it in the trees? The type of food that it utilizes, is it eating insects, seeds, plant material like leaves? Is it a predator? Is it going to go after herbivores? Timing of reproduction, does it reproduce very quickly? Is it slower? Does it reproduce during certain seasons? And then what kind of temperature, moisture requirements? What are the basic environmental conditions that have to be for the organism to survive? And then does this organism, is it prey for anyone? Does it get eaten by anyone? And then how does it influence the other species around it? How does it compete with other species around it? And so here's that example of that orchid and the long-tongued moth, seeing how they kind of co-evolve together, where it's super long tubed flower, and this moth has a really, really long proboscis or mouth parts to get to that nectar that's deep inside the flower. Now, like I said, species don't always cooperate harmoniously like the orchid and the moth. Some organisms try to fill the same niche, in which case that is going to be competition, right? They're competing for the same resources in the same niche. And so in competitive exclusion, two species basically battle it out for the same resources until one of the two species is more efficient and wins, and the other goes extinct or has to emigrate out of the area. So a good example of this are different sea urchins that live along the coast. And in some, they like to live within a certain range on that coast at certain depths. And wherever the two overlap or would try to overlap, one of them gets forced at a lower depth and the other one can survive at the higher depth, because the one that survives at the higher depth is able to push that other one out, right? He can better compete in that area. So you don't really see a lot of the lower depth urchins in that area because they just don't compete very well. And so you'll find them in different areas where you don't find the more competitive urchin. You also have evolutionary musical chairs, so to speak, and resource partitioning. Basically, the two species share their resources by altering their use of the niche. And this commonly will end up leading to character displacement, basically evolution in action, where the two species diverge and it divides the niche. So this is a good example of sympatric speciation, where two species, or a species, becomes two species within the same location because they're partitioning off the resources. So for example, let's say you have two types of birds living in an area and they like to eat seeds, and there's various sizes of seeds. You might find that in order to eliminate competition or to limit how much competition there is, the certain birds will go for the larger seeds, others will go for the smaller ones, and over time you'll see that each group will specialize either in the larger or the smaller seeds, and eventually over time they'll become two different species, one species of bird specializing in the large seeds and the other specializing in the small seeds. So the niche kind of gets divided up. Instead of it just being the seed eaters, you now have a niche of large seed eaters and a niche for small seed eaters. So let's say we're looking at these niches that are overlapping. We're looking at two paramecium species, and when you grow them under the same conditions but separately, they both thrive. They're very happy together. When you put them together, then you see that potentially one of those species of paramecium eliminates the other. It drives the second paramecium species to extinction. Or you could have resource partitioning, meaning like this paramecium in green is taking the top level of the tube and this purple one is taking the bottom tube. So they've divided up on their where they are in the tube, which niche. So we have like the top water niche and the bottom water niche. Right, and this happens because this eliminates competition between the two of them, right? If we didn't eliminate the competition, then the better competitor would completely eliminate the worse of the two. In the competition and character displacement, like I mentioned with the seeds and the birds, we have these two birds, right? There's a mixture of different types of seeds found on these islands, on all three. On this island, right, you have small and large seeds, small and large seeds, small and large seeds. And on this island, you only have one species of finches. On this island, you have a different species of finches. And on this middle island, you have both. And so what you see is on this island, there's no constraint, no competition. So all of these birds have the like kind of average beak, and they'll eat both the large and small seeds. Same thing with this third island, this species of finches. They can eat both large and small, so they have like a medium beak. But when you put the two of them together, there's too many finches, there's not enough food to go around. And so you end up seeing a divergence in beak size, with one group having a larger beak and the other group having a smaller beak. And they're specializing in seed types. So this one's going to specialize in large seeds, and this one specializes in small seeds. And eventually they can become two different species. And it's because there was just too much competition. And rather than eliminating the other species, they simply decided to eliminate the competition. So that's kind of the choice you have. Are you going to eliminate your competition? Like, are you going to eliminate the other species, or are you going to eliminate the competition altogether?